So for those of us in the Global South, the words aid, investment, funding kind of have become elegant cages where dependency traps dress up as generosity, and so many movements and initiatives in the Global South survive on funding from the Global North, which is a very convenient way for dominant powers to stay in control while appropriating the momentum to remain relevant. This logic is very simple, right? If you can't kill the movement, fund it and shape it. So how do you see those dynamics, and do you see as some possibilities to navigate that?
Well, I think the first question that I usually have is why? Why is this the case? Why can't Global South initiatives fund themselves? And the reason for that is because of much broader scopes of colonialism, including capitalism and modern slavery, where people don't earn enough to be able to then contribute to causes that they actually believe in beyond their taxes, let's say. But even so, most people don't want to pay taxes because they see their governments, especially global South governments, as corrupt. Whether that's true or not is a separate thing, because there is also something where the West makes us believe that our governments are corrupt, so that we continue to accept basically like poor treatment, etc. So there is this culture of accepting poor treatment because we're being told to expect poor treatment. And so at the same time, we don't have the resources to actually collectively fund things that we want. Of course, you will hear, every now and again, there's some kind of like hopeful story of like a film that was made because 10,000 farmers each paid 2 cents for this film to collectively be made at a super low budget, and then it like was shown in like 5 cinemas or something, and then this is considered like a huge effort. I mean, it is a huge effort, I'm not saying it's not, but it's not a success in the way of, if those farmers were paid better, think about what more they would have funded for themselves. So this is where the question for me needs to start, in terms of why do we even need funding from the global north? Let alone the fact that the global north continuously takes the bulk of the outputs of the labor and the profits of the labor from the global south, up to 95%. That is according to research done by Jason Hickel and his team on global inequality and why the global south continues to essentially fund the excesses of the global north. So this is not out of nowhere. This comes from structures of disenfranchisement that economically lock entire countries into this slavery, which is, they tell you, by choice, right? They tell you that you have the choice when you're born to kind of go to school and then be educated and do whatever vocation that you want to do, as long as you earn a salary, you work for a company, and if you're lucky, you can work for a foreign company that pays a little bit better. And then if you're even luckier, you'll get into the upper classes of your society and you'll be able to kind of like afford a condo or a car, or, become upper middle class or upper class. So this is kind of like the choice that we are given, even though we also actually have a choice not to participate in that society whatsoever, not to use our hard-earned money to fund a government system that doesn't actually fulfill its obligations with taxes, etc. So that's on the personal level, in terms of why don't we fund initiatives ourselves as citizens of the Global South? There's this other question about, well, why don't governments of the Global South fund initiatives that are good for the Global South? We all know why that is. I don't really need to go into that, but insert your comment here. And then there's this question, why is the Global North so interested in funding Global South initiatives? And this is where it comes into something called hybrid warfare, which is very much part of colonial world order system that relies on propaganda and dependency, because colonization cannot work without dependency. And so this funding that comes from the Global North not only cements the view of the global north as helpful towards the global south, as benevolent, etc. So it essentially washes away this kind of like master-slave dynamic between the global north, people who are profiteering from global south labor and resources. So it gives this impression of, well, we're giving back. But in reality, the amount that is given back is a very small fraction of the amount of profits that they get from the global south. So it is within this context that we must start to look at this question of, well, what are the possibilities that we can actually navigate this? As citizens of the global south who may not have a lot of resources, a lot of connections, or a lot of time to devote towards addressing something like this, which is extremely systematic. Well, we always, as I said, have the option to resist or to abandon. Resisting is a risk. We all know what the risks are. Oftentimes they can end up fatal, even if you're not really taking a major amount of impact. Let's say you're only reaching a few hundred people, etc. But there still is a risk because there are people in your local vicinity who feel threatened and they have the power or the budget to hire mercenaries or hitmen or whatever. So there are definitely very real risks when it comes to resisting. There are also risks when it comes to abandoning. And at the same time, if you can get many, many, many people around you to abandon the same system together or to slowly abandon them over a number of years, then we're talking about gaining agency over a long period of time to be able to actually set up new systems. That means that you fund things that you need for your community. When it comes to national level, honestly, more and more, I see this as a lost cause. I see nation states as something that was drawn up and set up by colonizers. They were the ones who literally handpicked the political elite when they gave independence to our states in the global south. So I don't really see any reason to uphold the nation state as we see it today in the global south. I think most of the time those borders obviously were drawn up to divide ethnicities, divide cultures, divide language groups, etc., and to sow discontent within nation states themselves, to keep them basically in a state of turmoil so that those countries never develop well enough to be any sort of challenge towards the global norm. So I don't really see any merit in upholding this idea of the nation state. And therefore, I don't see any merit in upholding this idea that global north countries should fund global south countries. I don't think global south countries should exist. I don't think global north countries should exist either, but that's kind of outside the scope of this question. These are some of the ways that I feel helpful in thinking about, especially myself, what I can do as an individual, what I can do through my connections, what I can do through my sort of like political life, if I have any in a certain country, etc. And also what I choose to volunteer in, because it's not only about what I can give in terms of resources or funding, or what I want to participate in, but it's also about my time, my energy, which I recognize not a lot of people have a lot of any of those things. Thinking in these ways can help to navigate that big question of like, well, what can I do? How can I get out of this? Like, what options do I have? At the same time, there are some real risks and, some things that we need to comply with, such as like paying taxes and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your question on why the global north wants so badly to fund the global south is a very big one. And now with everything that happened recently with USAID, for example, it became really clear how these things are instruments of soft power and is the survival thing. And is also the aspiration of becoming like the developed, and this seduction of offers of safety, recognition, a steady paycheck, questioning why that. And as you said, there is this branding thing of not only the soft power, but by looking good. What does it mean if the money sustaining the project was accumulated through the same extractive logics that the project claimed to oppose? Is it worth it in the end? And once you accept that money, rarely comes without any strings, right? Like projects need to bend, to soften, to adapt to the funder until they become this kind of domesticated pet. Of course, this is not generalizing, but it's often the case. So questioning that, the things we can control are within our personal reach. I think sometimes it was also internalized in the global south, this narrative of systems change, this grandiose thing that is like, you need to change entire systems. That is also leading us to depend on bigger funding and depend on these structures instead of looking at the things that we can change in our life choices and things we can support in our own communities and build this sovereignty and more localized support networks. It is very important to grow awareness on that and, start with the basics such as knowing where the money is coming from, do the due diligence, do your research, stay vigilant to co-optation and start asking why. What do they gain by financing you? Like breaking free from that naivety perception because you are gaining something. And then, as you said, also, like, I think we have been trained to receive so little and do many accommodations and trade-offs and see that as normal, but that is very beneficial for those who are distributing these helps. So I think it's very important to know boundaries with clarity. And as you said, develop strategies for your own sovereignty, like develop exit strategies and start building some smaller, more humble experiments in your own context to be able to free yourself and your community from these debt traps.
It's a very common question that sustainability consultants ask each other, which is, if ExxonMobil came and knocked on your door and gave you 100 million euros and then said, do whatever you want with it, I don't care, would you take the money? So this, for some reason, is like some very common question that is asked within the sustainability industry. And I used to be one of those people who said, yes, of course, are you kidding? Of course, I'll take the money. And I wasn't thinking, well, where did this money come from? Who was exploited, harmed, or killed in order for this money to land here in my hand? There is also a difference between taking money one time and then, signing a contract that gives you money over a period of time, like a monthly basis, for example, like a salary. That's a bit different. So I don't know. Some people take it differently. Some people have certain rationalizations that, well, money just kind of exists. So if somebody's handing it to me, I'm gonna like take it. In some ways, like there are these different levels of cognitive dissonance, essentially. And for people who are more involved in sort of like hands-on volunteering, that would be a big insult. For the people who are on the ground helping folk or helping other living beings or centered on land sovereignty, food sovereignty, etc., I think they can see much more clearly how all these things are connected, and they would feel much more strongly against taking money such as that, etc. So again, we come back to, well, who are you insulting by accepting that kind of money or by essentially allowing that kind of association that you would have with yourself? Just as I would not take money from Obama because I don't want to be associated with Obama, and I don't want to be associated with the US political class in any way, for example, just as I don't want to be associated with Netanyahu or the Israeli political class in any way. So why would I take that money? It does beg the question, how am I going to be seen by other people in the global south who are also playing to that sovereignty, whether or not there is any kind of like pressure from the funder themselves to conform, to certain narratives or to certain ideologies that they have. It comes back to centering the experience of those most harmed when thinking about, well, does funding sources really matter?